The autumn wind rattled the windows of Margaret Maggie Richardson's two-story colonial home in suburban Cleveland, Ohio, creating a symphony she'd grown to love during her 43 years of living there. At 68, Maggie had weathered many storms within these walls, literally and figuratively, but nothing had prepared her for the tempest that was about to tear through her carefully constructed world. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and vanilla, evidence of the apple pie cooling on the counter. Sunday dinners had been a Richardson family tradition for over 2 decades, even surviving her husband Robert's death 3 years prior. Tonight, her son Michael would arrive with his wife Patricia and their twin 15-year-old daughters, Emma and Sophie. These weekly gatherings had become Maggie's anchor, the rhythm that gave meaning to her weeks and reminded her that family remained her greatest achievement. Maggie smoothed her navy cardigan and adjusted the pearl earrings Robert had given her for their 25th anniversary. She'd maintained her appearance with the same care she'd given everything else in her life: her teaching career, her garden, her home, her family. Even retirement hadn't dulled her attention to detail or her belief that presentation mattered. The dining room table gleamed under the soft light of the chandelier, set with her grandmother's china and the silver candlesticks that had graced every important meal in the Richardson household. 6 place settings, though only 5 would be filled. She'd stopped removing Robert's place setting after the first year. Somehow, keeping it there made his absence feel less permanent. Michael's BMW pulled into the driveway at exactly 5:30, punctual as always. Through the window, Maggie watched her son emerge from the driver's seat, his expensive suit wrinkled from a long day at his financial consulting firm. At 42, Michael had inherited his father's broad shoulders and determined jaw, but where Robert had carried himself with quiet confidence, Michael moved with the restless energy of someone perpetually racing against time. Patricia emerged from the passenger seat, her auburn hair perfectly styled despite the wind, her designer dress impeccable even after what Maggie knew had been a full day of real estate showings. The twins tumbled out of the back seat, Emma immediately checking her phone while Sophie gathered her backpack, both girls moving with the controlled chaos that seemed to define modern teenagers. "Grandma Maggie," Sophie called out, bounding up the front steps with the enthusiasm that had always made her Maggie's secret favorite, though she'd never admit it aloud. "I brought my history project to show you. Mrs. Henderson said I did an amazing job on the Civil War timeline. I can't wait to see it, sweetheart," Maggie replied, opening the door wide to welcome her family. "And Emma, how was the drama club audition?" Emma looked up from her phone long enough to offer a genuine smile. "I got Lady Macbeth. Can you believe it? I'm so nervous, but Mr. Peterson said I had the best interpretation he'd heard in years." "That's wonderful, dear. Your grandfather would be so proud. He always said you had the soul of an actress." Michael and Patricia followed the girls inside, both carrying the subtle tension that Maggie had begun to notice more frequently in recent months. Michael's greeting was warm but distracted, his attention already shifting to the emails pinging on his phone. Patricia's embrace felt genuine, though Maggie caught the quick glance she exchanged with Michael, a wordless communication that spoke of conversations Maggie wasn't privy to. "Something smells incredible," Patricia said, following Maggie toward the kitchen. "Let me help you bring everything out." "Nonsense," Maggie replied, waving her away. "You work all week. Sunday dinner is my gift to the family. Besides, everything's ready. I've been cooking since this morning." It was true. Maggie had risen at 6, despite having nowhere urgent to be, and spent the day preparing Michael's favorite meal: pot roast with roasted vegetables, homemade dinner rolls, green bean casserole, and apple pie. The same menu she'd been making for Sunday dinners since the twins were toddlers, refined over years of practice until every dish achieved the perfect balance of flavors her family expected. As they settled around the dining table, Maggie found herself observing the familiar dynamics that had evolved over the years. Michael automatically took his father's chair at the head of the table, a transition that had happened gradually after Robert's death. Patricia sat to his right, close enough to manage any needs that arose with practiced efficiency. The twins flanked Maggie, chattering about school and friends with the easy comfort of children who had never doubted their grandmother's interest in their lives. "So, Mom," Michael began, cutting into his pot roast, "Patricia and I have been talking about some changes we're considering." Something in his tone made Maggie pause, her fork halfway to her mouth. "What kind of changes?" "Well, the girls are getting older, and we're thinking about maybe looking at some different housing options. Something that might be better suited to our current needs." Patricia jumped in smoothly, her real estate agent's training evident. "We've been looking at some beautiful properties in Shaker Heights. The school district is excellent, and it would cut Michael's commute in half. Shaker Heights is lovely," Maggie said carefully, though alarm bells were beginning to ring in her mind. Shaker Heights was 45 minutes away, far enough to transform weekly Sunday dinners into monthly obligations. "Are you thinking of moving soon?" "Nothing's definite yet," Michael said, but Maggie caught the way he avoided her eyes. "We're just exploring options. The market is really good right now for selling, and our house has appreciated significantly since we bought it." Emma looked up from her phone with sudden interest. "Wait, we're moving. What about my friends? What about the drama program?" "Nothing's decided, sweetheart," Patricia said quickly. "We're just looking at possibilities." Sophie's face crumpled with the dramatic devastation only a 15-year-old could muster. "But if we move to Shaker Heights, we won't be able to see Grandma Maggie every week. She lives here." The words hung in the air, highlighting the implication that Maggie had been trying not to acknowledge. If they moved, the easy intimacy of weekly dinners would become a thing of the past. The casual drop-ins, the emergency babysitting, the sense of being woven into the fabric of their daily lives, all of it would change. "We'll still see Grandma regularly," Michael said, his voice carrying the forced cheer of an adult trying to convince children that change wouldn't be traumatic. "It's not like we're moving across the country." But Maggie understood geography better than her son might have realized. 45 minutes might as well be 4 hours when it came to the spontaneous connections that had defined their relationship. The twins wouldn't stop by after school anymore. Michael wouldn't call on Saturday mornings to see if she needed anything from the hardware store. The rhythm of their shared life would be irreparably altered. "Have you made an offer on anything?" Maggie asked, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the growing tightness in her chest. "We're looking at a few properties," Patricia replied. "There's one in particular that we're quite excited about. 5 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, a finished basement for the girls, and a 3-car garage for Michael's workshop." The description painted a picture of a life that would require less of Maggie's involvement. No more emergency calls when the washing machine leaked. No more requests to watch the girls when Michael and Patricia wanted a date night. No more casual Sunday afternoon visits that stretched into impromptu dinners. "It sounds wonderful," Maggie managed, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. "When do you think you might make a decision?" "Soon," Michael said, finally meeting her eyes. "We don't want to miss the right opportunity." The conversation moved on to safer topics. The twins' schoolwork, Patricia's latest real estate successes, Michael's promotion to senior partner, but Maggie found herself struggling to engage. The pot roast that had seemed perfect when she'd tasted it earlier now felt dry and flavorless. The dining room that had always felt warm and welcoming now seemed too large, too formal, too empty despite being filled with family. After dinner, while Patricia helped clear the table and Michael retreated to his father's study to take a work call, Maggie found herself alone with the twins in the kitchen. Emma was loading the dishwasher with the efficiency of someone who'd performed this task countless times, while Sophie dried the china by hand, understanding instinctively that some things were too precious for mechanical washing. "Grandma," Sophie said quietly, "I don't want to move away from you." The simple honesty of the statement nearly undid Maggie's composure. "Oh, sweetheart. Change is part of life. Your parents know what's best for the family. But you're part of the family too," Emma said, surprising Maggie with her insight. "What's best for us should include what's best for you." Before Maggie could respond, Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway, his phone call apparently finished. "Girls, go get your things. We need to head home soon. Mom, can I talk to you for a minute? The twins exchanged a look that spoke of teenage intuition about adult conversations that weren't meant for their ears. They disappeared upstairs, supposedly to gather their belongings, but Maggie suspected they'd position themselves where they could overhear whatever was about to unfold. Michael leaned against the kitchen counter, his expression serious. Mom, I know the idea of us moving is difficult, but I need you to understand that this isn't just about wanting a bigger house. What is it about? Maggie asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. It's about positioning ourselves for the future. The girls will be in college soon, and we need to think about their educational opportunities, our retirement planning, and the kind of life we want to build for the next phase. Each word felt like a small cut, emphasizing how her son was planning a future that seemed to require less of her presence. I understand that you need to do what's best for your family. You are part of our family, Mom, but Michael paused, searching for words. But we also need to think about what's practical. You have your life here, your garden, your book club, your volunteer work at the library. It's not like you'd want to uproot everything and follow us to Shaker Heights. The assumption stung, partly because it wasn't entirely wrong. Maggie had built a life in this house, in this neighborhood, over 4 decades. Her roots ran deep here, but the casual dismissal of her willingness to adapt, to find ways to remain connected to her family, revealed something about how Michael viewed her role in their lives. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. Now back to the story. Of course not, she replied, forcing a smile. I'm quite settled here. Patricia rejoined them, carrying her purse and coat, her expression carefully neutral. Maggie, dinner was absolutely delicious. As always, thank you for going to so much trouble. It's never trouble, Maggie replied automatically, though for the first time in years, the words didn't feel entirely true. The next few minutes were filled with the familiar choreography of departure. Coats gathered, hugs exchanged, promises to call during the week. The twins clung to her a little longer than usual, as if sensing that something fundamental was shifting in their family dynamic. I love you, Grandma, Sophie whispered during their embrace. I love you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know. After the BMW disappeared around the corner, Maggie stood in her doorway for a long moment, breathing in the crisp October air. The house behind her felt suddenly cavernous, filled with the echoes of conversations and laughter that had sustained her through 3 years of widowhood. She moved through the evening routine that had become second nature, storing leftovers, washing the remaining dishes, setting out her clothes for tomorrow's volunteer shift at the library. But each familiar task felt different now, tinged with the awareness that the life she'd carefully constructed around her family's needs might be coming to an end. In the living room, she settled into Robert's favorite chair, surrounded by the photographs that documented decades of family history. Michael's graduation from business school, the twins' first steps, Christmas mornings and birthday celebrations, family vacations, and quiet Sunday afternoons, a life measured in shared moments, all of which now felt precarious. The phone rang, jolting her from her reverie. Michael's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment, hope fluttered in her chest. Perhaps he was calling to reassure her, to explain that the move wasn't certain, that their family bond wouldn't be diminished by geography. Hi, sweetheart, she answered, trying to inject warmth into her voice. Mom, I wanted to follow up on our conversation tonight. I know this is all sudden, and I want to make sure you understand that we're not trying to abandon you or anything like that. The words were meant to be comforting, but they highlighted fears Maggie hadn't even fully acknowledged. I know that. Michael, you have to do what's right for your family. We do, and I've been thinking, maybe this could be good for you too. You've been so focused on taking care of all of us since Dad died. Maybe it's time for you to think about what you want for your own life. The suggestion that her devotion to family had somehow limited her personal growth struck her as both true and deeply unfair. She had found purpose and joy in being needed. in being the center around which their family traditions revolved. The idea that this had been a burden rather than a blessing had never occurred to her. "I'm quite content with my life, Michael. I know you are, but maybe there's more out there for you. Maybe this is an opportunity to explore new interests, meet new people, try things you've never had time for when you were so busy taking care of everyone else." Each word felt like a gentle push toward a future she didn't want, delivered with the kind of loving condescension that made resistance seem petty and unreasonable. Michael was painting her choice to prioritize family as a limitation rather than a choice, suggesting that her happiness had been somehow incomplete because it was bound up with theirs. "Perhaps you're right," she said, because agreeing seemed easier than arguing. "I think I am. And Mom, we'll still see each other all the time. It's not like Shaker Heights is on another planet." After they hung up, Maggie sat in the growing darkness, processing the conversation that had felt more like a gentle dismissal than a reassurance. The house around her seemed to whisper with the voices of all the family gatherings that had filled these rooms with life and laughter. Now, apparently, it was time for those voices to find a new home, and for her to find a new purpose. She thought about Robert, about what he would have said if he'd been here for this conversation. He would have understood the geography of family bonds, the way distance could erode even the strongest connections through simple inconvenience. He would have seen what Maggie was only beginning to recognize, that this move wasn't just about Michael and Patricia wanting a bigger house. It was about them wanting a different kind of life, one that required less accommodation of an aging mother's needs and feelings. The realization settled over her like a heavy quilt, bringing both warmth and weight. Her family was growing up and moving on, as families do. The question was, what she would do with the space they left behind. 3 weeks after that first mention of Shaker Heights, Maggie found herself standing in her driveway at 7 in the morning, watching a real estate photographer circle her son's house with professional equipment. The for sale sign had appeared overnight like an unwelcome messenger, transforming the familiar landscape of her neighborhood into something foreign and threatening. Michael hadn't called to tell her about listing the house. She'd discovered it the way neighbors do, through the grapevine of morning dog walkers and the sudden appearance of strangers measuring the front yard. Mrs. Chainsher next door had been the one to break the news, approaching Maggie's fence with the cautious expression of someone delivering bad news. "I'm so sorry, Maggie. I thought you knew," Mrs. Chen had said, her voice gentle with sympathy. "The realtor said they're hoping for a quick sale. Apparently the market is very hot right now for houses in that price range." Maggie had managed to maintain her composure during the conversation, even expressing appropriate optimism about Michael and Patricia's new adventure. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The casual way her son had proceeded without including her in his plans spoke to a level of indifference she hadn't been prepared to face. Now, standing in the morning chill, she watched the photographer capture images that would entice strangers to imagine their lives in the space where her grandchildren had grown up. The swing set in the backyard where she'd pushed Emma and Sophie countless times. The kitchen window where Patricia often waved to her when she was working in her garden. The front steps where Michael had announced his engagement, his promotion, the twins' acceptance to advanced placement classes. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia. "Sorry you had to find out about the listing this way. Everything happened so fast with the photographer's schedule. We'll call you later to explain." The apology felt perfunctory, the kind of courtesy extended to a neighbor rather than a family member. Maggie pocketed the phone without responding and walked back toward her house, each step feeling heavier than the last. The morning routine, that had sustained her for years, coffee, newspaper, tending to her small herb garden, felt mechanical and purposeless. She found herself moving through the motions while her mind raced with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. How long had they been planning this? What else had they decided without consulting her? How quickly did they expect to move? The call from Patricia came just after 10, interrupting Maggie's half-hearted attempt to organize her recipe collection. "Maggie, I'm so sorry about this morning. I know seeing the photographer was probably a shock." "It was unexpected," Maggie replied, choosing her words carefully. "The thing is, our agent said we need to strike while the market is hot." She's already had 3 inquiries just from the listing photos going online this morning. We might have offers by the weekend. The efficiency was breathtaking. In less than 24 hours, her son's family had transformed from dinner guests discussing possibilities to sellers actively courting buyers. The speed suggested a level of certainty that made Maggie wonder how long the decision had actually been brewing before that Sunday night revelation. "That's wonderful for you," Maggie managed. "Quick sales are always preferable. We were thinking, if the timing works out right, we might be able to close and move before Christmas." Patricia's voice carried the excitement of someone describing a long-awaited vacation rather than a life change that would fundamentally alter family dynamics. Before Christmas. 6 weeks away, the holiday that had always been the centerpiece of their family traditions, celebrated in Michael's living room with the tree the twins decorated and the elaborate dinner Maggie had been planning since October. "Where will you spend Christmas?" The question escaped before Maggie could stop herself. "Oh, well, we haven't figured out all those details yet. Obviously, we'll want to establish new traditions in the new house. Maybe we could do something different this year, go out to dinner instead of cooking, or take a little family trip somewhere warm." Each word felt like a small betrayal. Christmas dinner had been Maggie's domain for over 20 years. A carefully orchestrated celebration that took weeks of preparation and filled her with purpose. The idea of replacing it with a restaurant meal or a vacation felt like erasing decades of shared history. "Of course," Maggie said. "New beginnings call for new traditions." After the call ended, she sat in her kitchen staring at the Christmas planning notebook that had already been filled with menu ideas and gift possibilities. The pages that had seemed so important that morning now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors. Emma and Sophie appeared at her back door, their school backpacks still slung over their shoulders, their faces showing the strain of teenagers trying to process adult decisions they had no control over. "Grandma, can we talk to you?" Emma asked, her usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. "Of course, sweethearts. Come in. I'll make you some hot chocolate." They settled at the kitchen table that had hosted countless homework sessions and heart-to-heart conversations over the years. Sophie's eyes were red-rimmed, suggesting tears that had been recently shed, while Emma maintained the careful composure of someone trying to be strong for others. "We found out about the house this morning," Sophie said without preamble. "Mom told us after school that we'll probably be moving next month." "How do you feel about that?" Maggie asked, though their expressions had already provided the answer. "Angry," Emma said, bluntly, and confused. Last month, they were talking about maybe moving someday. Now suddenly, it's happening immediately, and we don't get any say in it. "They keep saying it's going to be great," Sophie added, her voice thick with unshed tears. "That we'll love the new house and the new school district and all the opportunities. But what about the opportunities we already have here? What about our friends and our teachers and you?" The last word came out as a whisper, and Maggie felt her heart crack a little more. "Your parents are trying to do what they think is best for the family," she said, though the words felt inadequate. "But they're not thinking about all of the family," Emma replied with the sharp insight that sometimes surprised adults. "They're thinking about what's best for them and assuming everyone else will just adapt." The observation was more accurate than Maggie had been willing to admit to herself. Michael and Patricia were making decisions based on their professional ambitions and lifestyle preferences, trusting that everyone else would simply adjust to the new reality. "What's going to happen to you?" Sophie asked. "Will you be all alone here?" The question highlighted the fear that had been growing in Maggie's chest since Sunday night, not just the fear of loneliness, but the fear of irrelevance. Without her role as the family matriarch, the keeper of traditions, the reliable presence in her grandchildren's lives, who would she be? "I'll be fine," she lied. "I have my book club and my volunteer work and my garden. I'll manage quite well." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Those activities had been supplementary to her primary identity as Michael's mother and the twins' grandmother. Without the family connections that gave her life its central meaning, Would those other pursuits be enough to sustain her? The girls stayed for 2 hours, helping her make dinner and talking about everything except the move. But the undercurrent of impending loss ran through every conversation, every shared joke, every moment of comfortable silence. When their parents called to demand their return, the goodbyes felt more final than a typical Tuesday afternoon warranted. That evening, Maggie tried to call Michael to discuss the rapid timeline, but the call went straight to voicemail. She left a brief message asking him to call her back when he had a chance, trying to sound casual rather than desperate. When midnight came with no return call, she understood that she was no longer a priority in his increasingly busy schedule. Wednesday brought the first showing. Maggie watched from her living room window as a young couple with a toddler toured the house, their agent pointing out features with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested genuine interest. The husband took careful measurements while the wife tested light switches and examined closets. They moved through the space with the methodical attention of people who could already envision their lives there. Within 3 hours, Patricia texted to report that they'd received their first offer above asking price, with a 30-day closing. The speed was both impressive and devastating. Thursday's call from Michael came while Maggie was dusting the family photographs in her living room, a task that suddenly felt poignant rather than routine. "Mom, I have great news. We accepted an offer on the house. The buyers want to close December 15th, which gives us time to find something perfect in Shaker Heights and move before the holidays." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Maggie replied, though her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I know this is all happening quickly, but sometimes the best opportunities require quick action." Patricia found an incredible house yesterday, 6 bedrooms, a finished basement, and it backs up to a nature preserve. The girls are going to love having all that space to explore. Each detail of their new life felt like another step away from the life that had included her. More space meant less need for her small house as a gathering place. A nature preserve meant outdoor adventures that wouldn't require her garden as entertainment. 6 bedrooms meant plenty of room for guests who weren't her. "It sounds perfect for your family," she said. "It really is. And Mom, I've been thinking about what we discussed about this being a good opportunity for you to explore new directions. Maybe you should consider some changes too. Shake things up a little." The suggestion carried an undertone that made Maggie's stomach tighten. "What kind of changes?" "Well, you've been in that house for over 40 years. Maybe it's time to think about something smaller, more manageable. Something designed for your current needs rather than the needs of a family with young children." The implication was clear. If Michael's family was moving on to bigger and better things, perhaps it was time for her to move on to smaller and more practical things. The house that had been the center of their family life was suddenly being reframed as too large, too much trouble, too much for a woman her age to handle alone. "I'm quite comfortable where I am," she said. "I know you are, but comfort isn't always the same thing as what's best for us. You're 68, Mom. At some point, you're going to need to think about accessibility, maintenance, proximity to medical facilities. Wouldn't it be better to make those changes while you're healthy and can really choose what you want, rather than waiting until circumstances force your hand?" Each word felt like a gentle push toward a future she didn't want, delivered with the kind of reasonable concern that made resistance seem stubborn and short-sighted. Michael was painting her attachment to her home as emotional rather than practical, suggesting that her comfort was less important than theoretical future needs. "Perhaps you're right," she said, because arguing seemed pointless. "I think I am. And who knows, maybe you'll discover opportunities you never considered. Maybe this is exactly the push you need to try something new and exciting." That night, alone in the house that apparently represented outdated thinking rather than cherished history, Maggie found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her place in her family's life. The ease with which Michael was ready to reshape her living situation suggested that her preferences and attachments were less important than his vision of what her life should look like. She walked through the rooms that had housed decades of family memories, seeing them now through the lens of her son's assessment. The formal dining room that hosted holiday meals but sat empty most of the year. The guest bedroom that was rarely used, the craft room where she pursued hobbies that suddenly seemed frivolous rather than fulfilling. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps she was clinging to a life that no longer served her, maintaining spaces and routines that made sense when she was the center of an active family, but now just emphasized her growing irrelevance. Friday morning brought a call that changed everything. "Mrs. Richardson, this is Jennifer Walsh from Sunshine Senior Living. Your son Michael contacted us about arranging a tour for you. We'd love to show you around our facility and discuss how we might meet your needs." The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. Michael hadn't just suggested she consider downsizing. He had already begun researching options and contacting facilities on her behalf. The presumption was breathtaking, but so was the efficiency. In the space of a week, he had managed to list his house, accept an offer, and begin arranging what he apparently viewed as the logical next step in her life. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Maggie said carefully. "I haven't expressed interest in senior living facilities." "Oh," Jennifer's voice carried the confusion of someone whose script had been disrupted. "Mr. Richardson was quite specific about wanting to arrange a tour. He mentioned that you were ready to explore more supportive living options." Ready. As if she had been the one to initiate this conversation rather than the recipient of decisions made on her behalf. "Could I call you back?" Maggie asked. "I need to clarify some things with my son." "Of course, we're here whenever you're ready to visit." The call to Michael went directly to voicemail again, but this time Maggie's message was different. "Michael, I need you to call me immediately. We need to discuss the conversation you had with Sunshine Senior Living. This is not acceptable." He called back within an hour, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone who knew he had overstepped, but wasn't entirely sorry about it. "Mom, I can explain. I hope so, because I'm having trouble understanding how you thought it was appropriate to contact senior living facilities on my behalf without discussing it with me first. I was just gathering information. I thought if I could present you with some options, it might make the whole idea seem less overwhelming." "What's the whole idea?" "I never said I was interested in senior living. Not in so many words. But when we talked about making changes, about exploring new possibilities, I thought this was the logical direction." Logical for whom? There was a pause, and when Michael spoke again, his voice had taken on the patient tone adults used with unreasonable children. "Mom, I'm trying to help you plan for the future. I know change is scary, but sometimes we need to make decisions based on what's practical rather than what's comfortable. And you believe it's practical for me to move to a senior living facility. I think it would give you opportunities for social connection with people your own age. I think it would relieve you of the burden of maintaining a house that's really too big for one person. I think it would give you access to medical support and activities designed for your interests and abilities." Each benefit he listed felt like another way of saying she was too old, too isolated, too much trouble to maintain her current life. The kindness in his voice made it worse, suggesting that he genuinely believed he was helping her rather than managing her. "What if I don't want those opportunities?" she asked. "Then we'd discuss other options." "But Mom, wouldn't it be worth at least looking? Just to see what's available?" The reasonableness of the request made it difficult to refuse without seeming stubborn or closed-minded. But Maggie understood that agreeing to a tour would be the first step in a process that would become increasingly difficult to resist. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "That's all I'm asking. Just think about it." But as she hung up the phone, Maggie realized that thinking was exactly what she'd been avoiding. Because the more she thought about Michael's suggestions, his plans, his vision for her future, the more clearly she could see what was really happening. Her son wasn't trying to help her explore new opportunities. He was trying to solve the problem she represented. The aging mother who required consideration, who complicated his family's plans, who stood as a reminder of obligations that no longer fit comfortably into his life. The realization settled over her like a cold wind, bringing clarity she hadn't wanted but could no longer avoid. Michael loved her. She was certain of that, but his love had become contaminated with inconvenience. And his solution was to find a place where her needs could be met by someone else, freeing him to build the life he wanted without the complications she represented. Standing in her kitchen as the afternoon light faded, Surrounded by the evidence of a life built around family connection, Maggie understood that she was facing a choice she had never imagined having to make. She could accept Michael's version of her future, smaller, safer, more managed, or she could find another way forward. The question was whether she had the courage to choose something different. The tour of Sunshine Senior Living took place on a Tuesday morning that felt more like a funeral than an exploration of possibilities. Maggie had finally agreed to visit, not out of genuine interest, but because Michael's persistent calls had worn down her resistance. He had framed it as gathering information and keeping options open, but she understood it was really about moving her toward a decision he had already made on her behalf. Jennifer Walsh, the admissions coordinator, was everything Maggie expected: professionally cheerful, impeccably dressed, and armed with statistics about resident satisfaction and health outcomes. She guided Maggie through corridors lined with inspirational artwork and activity schedules, past common areas filled with elderly residents playing cards or watching television. "Our residents love the sense of community here," Jennifer explained, gesturing toward a group of women working on a jigsaw puzzle. "Many of them tell us they wish they'd made the transition sooner. It's amazing how quickly people adapt when they're surrounded by peers who understand their experiences." The word adapt stuck in Maggie's mind like a splinter. Everyone expected her to adapt to Michael's timeline, to his vision of her future, to a life that bore no resemblance to the one she had carefully constructed over decades. But what if she didn't want to adapt? What if the life she had was still the life she wanted? The apartment they showed her was pleasant enough: a one-bedroom unit with a small kitchenette, a bathroom with safety features, and a living area that could accommodate her favorite chair and a few personal belongings. The window looked out onto a courtyard where residents sat on benches feeding birds from small plastic containers. "The meals are included, of course," Jennifer continued, "and we have a wonderful activities coordinator who plans everything from book clubs to exercise classes. We also provide transportation to medical appointments and shopping trips twice a week." Each amenity sounded like another layer of management, another way her independence would be packaged and scheduled by someone else. The life Jennifer described was safe, convenient, and utterly devoid of the autonomy Maggie had taken for granted. "What do you think?" Michael asked as they walked to their cars afterward. He had met them for the tour, taking time off work to demonstrate his investment in her decision. "It's very nice," Maggie replied, because any other response would have required an argument she wasn't prepared to have in a parking lot. "I think it could be perfect for you. The location is great, close to your doctor, near that shopping center you like, and having meals provided would be such a relief. No more worrying about grocery shopping or cooking for one." The assumption that she found grocery shopping and cooking burdensome revealed how little Michael understood about what gave her life meaning. Those activities weren't chores to be eliminated. They were connections to her autonomy, her creativity, her sense of purpose. "The timing could work out perfectly," he continued. "They have an opening in January, right after we move. You could transition directly from the house to your new apartment without any overlap or stress." The coordination was seamless, efficient, and completely removed from any input she might have about the timing of her own life transitions. Michael had managed to align her housing situation with his family's needs, ensuring that her move wouldn't interfere with their plans or create any inconvenience for them. "I need time to think about it," she said. "Of course, but don't think too long," Jennifer said. "They rarely have openings, and January is perfect timing for everyone." Perfect timing for everyone except her. That afternoon, Maggie found herself walking through her house with new eyes, seeing it as Michael apparently did: too large, too much trouble, too much for someone her age to manage alone. The guest bedroom where the twins had sleepovers became evidence of wasted space. The dining room where she hosted holiday meals became a symbol of outdated expectations. The garden she tended with such care became a burden rather than a joy. She tried calling her sister Helen in Phoenix, hoping for perspective from someone who might understand the magnitude of what was being asked of her. But Helen's response was disappointingly similar to Michael's reasoning. "Oh, Maggie, that sounds wonderful. I've been telling you for years that you're rattling around in that big house. And having meals provided? What a luxury. I spend half my time figuring out what to eat. But what about my independence? Maggie asked. Independence doesn't mean doing everything yourself just to prove you can. Sometimes independence means making smart choices about where to put your energy. You could focus on the things you really enjoy instead of wasting time on household maintenance. The conversation left Maggie feeling more isolated than before. Even Helen, who had shared so many of her life experiences, couldn't understand why the prospect of managed living felt like a death sentence rather than a liberation. The next few weeks blurred together in a haze of well-meaning pressure and increasing isolation. Michael called daily to check on her thinking process, always with updates about their house sale or questions about her timeline for making a decision. Patricia sent cheerful texts about packing tips and moving strategies, as if Maggie's relocation was already a foregone conclusion. The twins visited less frequently, caught up in the excitement and trauma of their own impending move. When they did come by, their conversations were dominated by discussions of their new school, their new bedrooms, their new opportunity. Maggie found herself becoming a supporting character in their narratives, rather than a central figure in their lives. The book club meeting in early November brought the first real taste of how her social connections were beginning to shift. She had been part of this group for 8 years, meeting monthly in each other's homes to discuss everything from literary fiction to popular mysteries. These women had supported her through Robert's illness and death, celebrated her grandchildren's achievements, and provided the kind of steady friendship that sustained her through difficult times. "Maggie, we heard about Michael's move," said Dorothy Hanson, the group's unofficial leader. "How are you handling all the changes?" "It's an adjustment," Maggie replied carefully, "but I'm happy for them. It's a wonderful opportunity." "And what about you?" asked Susan Martinez, always the most direct member of the group. "Are you planning to stay in the house?" The question she had been dreading hung in the air, surrounded by the curious and concerned faces of women who had become her closest friends. How could she explain that her son was pressuring her to move to senior living without sounding like a victim? How could she admit that she felt powerless to resist his plans without appearing weak or helpless? "I'm exploring some options," she said finally. The conversation moved on, but Maggie caught the meaningful glances exchanged between the other women. She understood that her situation was becoming a topic of discussion even when she wasn't present, that her friends were beginning to see her as someone who needed their concern rather than their companionship. Walking home from Dorothy's house that evening, Maggie felt the weight of her growing isolation. The people who cared about her were gradually repositioning themselves as supporters of decisions she hadn't made, rather than allies in helping her figure out what she actually wanted. The pressure intensified as Thanksgiving approached. Michael's family would be spending the holiday at Patricia's sister's house in Columbus, breaking a tradition that had sustained Maggie through 3 years of widowhood. The casual announcement came during one of his daily check-in calls, delivered as if it were a minor scheduling change rather than the abandonment of a family tradition that had anchored her year. "We thought it would be good for the girls to spend time with their cousins before we move," he explained. "And honestly, it'll be nice not to have to worry about cooking a big meal when we're dealing with all the packing and house prep." The subtext was clear. Hosting Thanksgiving dinner had become a burden rather than a cherished tradition, and his family's needs now took precedence over maintaining connections that had once been automatic. "Of course," Maggie replied. "That sounds lovely for everyone. What will you do? I'm sure Helen would love to have you visit Phoenix. Or maybe this would be a good time to check out some of those senior communities we discussed. See how they handle holiday meals, get a feel for their social activities." Even her Thanksgiving plans were being reframed as research opportunities for her inevitable transition to managed living. Michael couldn't simply acknowledge that his family's change in plans left her alone. He had to present it as an opportunity for her to further explore the future he had chosen for her. Thanksgiving Day arrived gray and cold, with the kind of November weather that made staying indoors feel like wisdom rather than defeat. Maggie prepared a small meal for herself: turkey breast, stuffing, green bean casserole, going through the motions of tradition even though the purpose felt hollow. She set the table with her good china, lit the candles that had graced every family meal for decades, and tried to find gratitude in the silence that filled her dining room. But the empty chairs around the table spoke louder than any prayer, reminding her that the life she had built around family connection was crumbling away one tradition at a time. The phone call from Michael came in the late afternoon, filled with cheerful updates about their day in Columbus and carefully worded questions about how she was holding up. She assured him that she was having a lovely, quiet day, because admitting to loneliness would only reinforce his belief that she needed the social stimulation of senior living. December brought the closing on Michael's house and the finalization of their move to Shaker Heights. Maggie helped them pack, sorting through decades of family belongings, and watching as her grandchildren's childhood was reduced to boxes labeled Emma's room and Sophie's room. Each item that went into storage or donation bags felt like another piece of their shared history being discarded. The new house was everything Patricia had promised, spacious, modern, and perfectly designed for their current needs. But it felt foreign to Maggie, lacking the history and familiarity that had made Michael's previous home feel like an extension of her own. The kitchen was too sleek for comfortable conversation. The living areas were too large for intimate gatherings. The distance from her house was too far for casual visit. "What do you think?" Patricia asked, giving her a tour of the space that would now host whatever family gatherings remained in their future. "It's beautiful," Maggie replied honestly. "You'll be very happy here." But even as she spoke the words, she understood that you no longer automatically included her. This house had been chosen for Michael's family's happiness, and her comfort or connection to the space was at best a secondary consideration. The first Sunday dinner in the new house took place 3 weeks before Christmas, and everything about it felt different. The drive to Shaker Heights took 45 minutes in good traffic, turning what had been a spontaneous tradition into a planned expedition. The dining room was larger but somehow less intimate, making conversation feel formal rather than comfortable. The twins seemed smaller in the expansive space, their voices echoing in ways that made casual chatter feel forced. They were excited about their new school and new friends, but their enthusiasm felt distant to Maggie, connected to experiences and places that had nothing to do with her life. "So, Mom," Michael said as they finished Patricia's store-bought dessert, "have you made any decisions about Sunshine Senior Living? Jennifer called last week to check on your timeline." The fact that Jennifer was calling him rather than her spoke volumes about who was really driving this decision process. Maggie had become a passive participant in the planning of her own future, expected to ratify choices that others were making on her behalf. "I'm still considering it," she replied. "Well, don't consider it too long. They're holding that January opening, but they can't wait indefinitely. And honestly, Mom, I think the sooner you make this transition, the better it will be for everyone." For everyone. The phrase echoed in Maggie's mind as she drove home through the winter darkness, past neighborhoods where families were settling in for quiet Sunday evenings. Her resistance to Michael's plans wasn't just inconvenient for him, it was apparently problematic for everyone involved. At home, she sat in Robert's chair, surrounded by the Christmas decorations she had put up out of habit, rather than joy. The tree that had once been the centerpiece of family celebrations now felt like a monument to traditions that no one else valued enough to maintain. The house around her felt simultaneously too large and too small. Too large for her daily needs, but too small for the family gatherings that had given it meaning. She was rattling around in spaces designed for a life she no longer lived, clinging to routines that served no one's needs but her own. For the first time since Robert's death, Maggie found herself questioning not just Michael's plans for her future, but her own stubborn attachment to a life that might indeed be outdated. Perhaps everyone else could see something she was too proud or too frightened to acknowledge. Perhaps her resistance to change was just another form of self-deception, a way of avoiding the reality that her usefulness to her family had expired along with her role as wife and active mother. The thought settled over her like a heavy blanket, bringing neither comfort nor warmth, but a kind of resigned exhaustion that made resistance feel pointless. Maybe it was time to stop fighting what everyone else seemed to think was inevitable. Maybe it was time to adapt, as Jennifer had put it, to a life that required less of the people she loved and asked more of the professionals who were paid to care. Christmas Eve arrived with an unexpected snowfall that blanketed Cleveland in the kind of pristine white that made the whole city look like a greeting card. Maggie stood at her kitchen window, watching the flakes accumulate on the bird feeder she'd filled that morning, and tried to summon some semblance of holiday spirit. The house felt cavernous around her, decorated with ornaments that told the story of decades of family celebrations. But this year they seemed more like museum pieces than joyful reminders. Michael's family wouldn't be coming for Christmas dinner. They were hosting Patricia's parents at their new house, establishing fresh traditions in their fresh space. Maggie had been invited, of course, but the invitation felt obligatory rather than enthusiastic, extended with the careful politeness reserved for distant relatives, rather than immediate family. "We'd love to have you join us, Mom," Michael had said during their last conversation. "Though I should warn you, Patricia's mother has some pretty strong opinions about everything, and her father tends to dominate conversations about politics." It might be a little overwhelming. The subtext was clear. Her presence would complicate the dynamics of their new family configuration. She would be the outsider who required special consideration, the elderly guest who needed to be managed rather than simply included. "I think I'll stay home this year," she replied. "I'm not feeling quite up to a big gathering." "Are you sure? I don't like the idea of you being alone on Christmas." But apparently he didn't dislike it enough to prioritize her comfort over his in-laws' preferences, or to suggest that Christmas dinner take place at her house as it had for the previous 23 years. Now, as the snow continued to fall, Maggie found herself preparing Christmas Eve dinner for one. She had bought a small ham, made her traditional sweet potato casserole, and even baked cookies that would likely go uneaten. The rituals provided structure to a day that would otherwise feel shapeless and purposeless. The doorbell rang just as she was setting the table, and she opened it to find Dorothy Hanson standing on her porch holding a covered dish and wearing the expression of someone on a mission. "I brought you some of my famous green bean almondine," Dorothy announced, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Frank is at his son's house in Akron, and I thought you might like some company." The gesture was kind, but it also highlighted how transparent her isolation had become to her social circle. Dorothy had clearly decided that Maggie needed rescuing from her solitude, which meant her situation had become a topic of concern rather than simply an unfortunate circumstance. "That's very thoughtful," Maggie said, accepting the dish. "Would you like to stay for dinner? I was hoping you'd ask." As they sat at the dining room table, surrounded by the Christmas decorations that had witnessed so many family celebrations, Dorothy broached the subject that had obviously motivated her visit. "Maggie, I've been thinking about our conversation at book club last month. About you exploring your options. How is that going?" The question was gentle but pointed, delivered with the kind of caring directness that true friends employed when they were worried about someone's judgment. "It's going," Maggie replied carefully. "Because I have to tell you, some of us have been concerned. Susan mentioned that she drove by here the other night and saw that you had every light in the house on, which seemed unusual, and Mrs. Patterson next door said she hasn't seen you working in your garden lately, which isn't like you." The realization that her neighbors and friends were monitoring her behavior felt both touching and intrusive. She had become someone who required watching, whose patterns were noteworthy when they deviated from expected norms. "I've been busy with other things," she said. What kind of things? It was a fair question, and Maggie found herself struggling to answer it honestly. What had she been busy with? Avoiding Michael's calls about senior living timelines, wandering through her house looking for purposes that no longer existed, sitting in Robert's chair trying to summon the energy to care about activities that had once brought her pleasure. "Just thinking," she said finally. Dorothy's expression softened with the kind of sympathy that made Maggie want to crawl under the table. "Oh, honey, that's exactly what I was afraid of. Too much thinking and not enough living." "What do you mean?" "I mean that you've been rattling around in this house for months, overthinking every decision, second-guessing every option. Sometimes the best thing you can do is stop analyzing and start acting." The advice sounded remarkably similar to Michael's reasoning about making quick decisions and seizing opportunities. Even Dorothy, who had no financial interest in Maggie's housing situation, seemed to believe that her reluctance to embrace change was evidence of poor judgment rather than legitimate preference. Acting on what? Maggie asked. On what's best for your future. Michael told Susan at the grocery store that he's found some wonderful senior living options for you. Places where you'd have built-in social connections, professional support, activities designed for people your age. Why are you fighting something that could improve your quality of life? The fact that Michael was discussing her living situation with acquaintances at the grocery store felt like a violation of privacy, but it also revealed how broadly he was seeking support for his vision of her future. He wasn't just pressuring her directly, he was building a network of community opinion that would make resistance increasingly difficult. I'm not fighting anything, Maggie said. I'm just not convinced that changing everything about my life is necessary. But what if it's not necessary? What if it's about optimal? What if there's a better way to live than what you're doing now? Dorothy's questions echoed the same logic that had been wearing away at Maggie's resistance for months. Everyone seemed convinced that her current life was suboptimal, that her attachment to her home and routines was evidence of limited vision rather than reasonable contentment. After Dorothy left, carrying with her the remainder of the green bean almondine and promises to check in soon, Maggie sat alone with the weight of yet another well-meaning intervention. The people who cared about her were united in their belief that she needed to make changes, and their unanimous concern was beginning to make her question her own judgment. The phone call from Emma came just after 9 o'clock, interrupting Maggie's half-hearted attempt to watch a Christmas movie. "Grandma, I wanted to call and wish you Merry Christmas Eve," Emma said, her voice carrying the careful cheer of someone trying to compensate for difficult circumstances. "Merry Christmas Eve to you too, sweetheart. How are you settling into the new house?" "It's fine. Different, but fine. Sophie's already made friends with the girl next door, and my room is bigger than my old one." "But Grandma, I need to ask you something." "What's that?" "Dad keeps talking about you moving to some kind of senior place. Is that really what you want?" The directness of the question caught Maggie off guard. In all the conversations about her future, no one had simply asked her what she wanted. They had asked about her needs, her concerns, her practical considerations, but not about her desires. "It's complicated, Emma." "It doesn't seem complicated to me. Do you want to move there or not?" "No," Maggie said, the word escaping before she could temper it with qualifications or explanations. "No, I don't want to move there." "Then why is everyone acting like it's already decided?" It was a question that struck at the heart of what had been troubling Maggie for months. When had her preferences become secondary to everyone else's assessment of what was best for her? When did her voice in her own life become advisory rather than decisive? "I don't know, sweetheart." "Grandma, can I tell you something? Something I probably shouldn't tell you?" "Of course. I heard Mom and Dad talking the other night about timing. Dad said something about how if you moved into that place in January it would solve their problem about what to do with you during our spring break trip. Mom said it would be a relief not to have to worry about checking on you while they're gone." Each word felt like a small knife, cutting away the illusions Maggie had maintained about her son's motivations. The senior living facility wasn't just about her safety or social needs. It was about eliminating the inconvenience she represented to their increasingly busy lives. "Emma, you shouldn't. I know I shouldn't repeat conversations, but Grandma, they're talking about your life like you're a problem they need to solve. And that's not right." After the call ended, Maggie sat in the darkness of her living room, surrounded by the Christmas lights that had once symbolized joy and family connection, but now felt like markers of a tradition that no one else valued enough to maintain. The conversation with Emma had crystallized something that she had been trying not to see. Her family loved her, but they also saw her as an obligation that needed to be managed efficiently. The next morning, Christmas Day, brought a perfunctory call from Michael's family, with each member taking turns to wish her well and share highlights of their celebration. The twins sounded genuinely happy, excited about their gifts and their new traditions. Patricia was gracious and warm, asking about Maggie's day and expressing regret that she wasn't with them. Michael was cheerful but distracted, clearly eager to return to his family's festivities. "How was your quiet Christmas?" he asked. Peaceful, she replied, because describing her loneliness would only reinforce his belief that she needed more social stimulation than her current life provided. Good. Sometimes quiet is exactly what we need. Hey, I wanted to mention, Jennifer from Sunshine Senior Living called yesterday to check on your timeline. I told her you were still thinking, but she wanted me to let you know that they're getting some pressure about that January opening. If you're not ready to commit soon, they'll need to offer it to someone else. Even on Christmas Day, the pressure continued. Michael couldn't simply call to wish her well. He had to include updates about deadlines and other people's needs for her potential living space. I understand, she said. I think we should probably have a serious conversation about this soon. Maybe next week, after the holidays. We need to make some decisions. As if the choice about where she would live was a collaborative decision rather than her own to make. That afternoon, as Maggie cleaned up from her solitary Christmas dinner, she made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would call Jennifer Walsh and schedule another tour of Sunshine Senior Living, not because she wanted to live there, but because she needed to understand exactly what her life would look like if she surrendered to everyone else's vision of her future. The tour took place 3 days later, and this time Maggie paid attention to details she had missed during her first visit. She watched the residents more carefully, noting the way they moved through their prescribed routines. She listened more closely to Jennifer's descriptions of activities and schedules. She asked questions about autonomy, about personal choice, about what happened when residents disagreed with staff recommendations. We find that most of our residents appreciate having structure, Jennifer explained when Maggie asked about flexibility in daily routines. It eliminates the stress of constantly making decisions about meals, activities, and social interactions. Our staff are trained to help residents make choices that support their health and well-being. The phrase, "help residents make choices," stuck with Maggie long after she left the facility. It sounded benevolent, but it also suggested a level of management that would fundamentally alter her relationship with her own life. Her choices would become guided choices, her preferences filtered through professional assessment of what was best for her. That evening, she called her friend Susan Martinez, hoping for perspective from someone whose opinion she respected. Susan, can I ask you something? Do you think I'm being unreasonable about not wanting to move to senior living? There was a pause before Susan answered, and Maggie braced herself for another gentle lecture about adaptation and optimal living. You know what, Maggie? I think you're being exactly as reasonable as you should be. It's your life, and you're the only one who gets to decide how to live it. The validation hit Maggie like a physical force, bringing tears she hadn't realized she'd been holding back. Really? Really. I've been watching this whole situation unfold. And frankly, I think Michael means well, but he's forgotten that you're still a competent adult who gets to make her own decisions. You don't need anyone's permission to live in your own house. For the first time in months, Maggie felt like someone was seeing her as she was rather than as a problem to be solved. Susan's words gave her permission to trust her own judgment, to value her own preferences, to resist the pressure that had been building around her like a slowly tightening net. What do you think I should do? I think you should tell Michael exactly what you want and stop worrying about whether it's convenient for everyone else. You've spent your whole life putting other people's needs first. Maybe it's time to put your own needs first, for a change. The conversation with Susan marked a turning point, the moment when Maggie began to understand that her resistance to change wasn't evidence of poor judgment or stubborn inflexibility. It was evidence of self-knowledge, of understanding what gave her life meaning and purpose. But recognizing her right to choose her own path was only the first step. The harder task would be asserting that right in the face of all the people who were convinced they knew better than she did what was best for her future. The confrontation began innocuously enough, with Michael arriving at Maggie's house on New Year's Day carrying a folder of papers and wearing the expression of someone prepared to handle business. He had called that morning to ask if he could stop by to finalize some details, and Maggie had agreed, though she suspected his definition of details would differ significantly from hers. "Happy New Year, Mom," he said, settling into the living room chair that had become his preferred spot for serious conversations. "I hope you had a peaceful evening." "I did. she replied, though peaceful might not have been the right word for the hours she'd spent rehearsing this conversation in her mind. Susan's words about putting her own needs first had given her courage, but courage and clarity were different things entirely. Good. I wanted to start the year by getting some things settled. He opened the folder and pulled out several documents. I've brought the application for Sunshine Senior Living. Jennifer needs it back by January 5th, if we want to secure that opening, so I thought we could fill it out together today. The assumption that they would be filling it out together revealed everything about how Michael viewed this decision process. He wasn't asking for her choice, he was facilitating the implementation of a choice he believed had already been made. Michael, we need to talk about this. Absolutely. That's why I'm here. I know this is a big step and I want to make sure you understand all the benefits. The social opportunities alone will be— No, I need to talk about whether I'm making this step at all. Michael's pen paused over the application form, and he looked up with the patient expression of someone prepared to address reasonable concerns while moving toward a predetermined conclusion. Mom, I thought we'd settled this. You agreed to tour the facility. You said it was very nice. I said it was nice. I didn't say I wanted to live there. But you haven't said you don't want to live there either. And at some point, we need to move from considering options to making decisions. The word "we" hung in the air between them, highlighting the fundamental disagreement about who had authority over this choice. Michael was speaking as if her living situation was a family decision requiring consensus, while Maggie was beginning to understand that it was her decision to make alone. What if I've already made a decision? She asked. Then, I'd want to make sure it's an informed decision based on a realistic assessment of your needs and options, not just emotional attachment to familiar surroundings. The dismissal of her potential choice as emotional attachment, rather than legitimate preference, stung more than Michael probably intended. He was categorizing her desires as feelings to be managed rather than factors to be respected. Michael, what if I don't want to move to senior living? Then we'd need to discuss alternatives. But Mom, honestly, what are the alternatives? You can't maintain this house indefinitely. The upkeep, the isolation, the distance from medical facilities, at some point, these things are going to become real problems. What if they're not problems for me? They may not feel like problems now, but that doesn't mean they won't become problems. Part of good planning is anticipating future needs, not just addressing current preferences. Each response felt like a gentle but firm redirection away from her autonomy and toward his assessment of what was practical and sensible. Michael wasn't refusing to listen to her. He was explaining why her perspective was limited, and his was more comprehensive. What if I'm willing to take that risk? She asked. What risk? The risk that I might face challenges in the future. The risk that I might need help that's not immediately available. The risk that my choices today might not be optimal for my circumstances tomorrow. Michael set down his pen and looked at her with the kind of concerned attention that parents gave to children who were expressing unrealistic expectations about life. Mom, that's not a risk. It's a certainty. Everyone your age faces increasing challenges with mobility, health, social isolation. The question isn't whether you'll need more support. It's whether you'll have that support available when you need it. And what if I'd rather face those challenges in my own home? In a house that's too big, too far from medical facilities, too isolated from social connections? Mom, that's not brave. That's just stubborn. The word stubborn landed like a slap, reducing her desire for autonomy to a character flaw that needed to be overcome rather than a preference that deserved respect. I see, she said quietly. Do you? Because I'm not trying to be harsh, but I need you to understand that your resistance to change is going to make things harder for everyone, including you. There it was, the admission that her preferences were not just impractical, but inconvenient for other people. Michael's concern for her well-being was real, but it was contaminated by his need for her decisions to align with his family's comfort and convenience. Harder for everyone. How? Michael shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the directness of the question. Mom, you know I worry about you. We all do. And when you're living alone in this big house, 45 minutes away from us, That worry becomes a constant background stress in our lives. So this is about your stress, not my needs. It's about both, your needs and our ability to meet them responsibly. If something happens to you here, how quickly can we respond? If you have a medical emergency, how long before help arrives? If you fall and can't reach the phone, how long before someone realizes you're in trouble? Each scenario he painted was designed to highlight her vulnerability and his family's inability to provide adequate protection from a distance. The message was clear: her choice to remain in her home created problems for people who loved her, and love required her to minimize those problems. Michael, what if I told you that I'm willing to accept those risks because living here, in my own home surrounded by my own things, maintaining my own routines, gives my life meaning that institutional living can't provide? I'd say that meaning is important, but safety is more important. I'd say that your quality of life won't matter if you're injured or isolated or unable to get help when you need it. And what if I disagree with your assessment of what's more important? The question seemed to catch Michael off guard. He had been operating from the assumption that reasonable people would naturally prioritize safety over autonomy, convenience over attachment, professional care over personal independence. Mom, you can't seriously be telling me that you'd rather risk your health and safety than move to a place where you'd have professional support and social opportunities. I'm telling you that I'd rather take responsibility for my own risks than surrender my autonomy to avoid them. That's not reasonable. According to whom? According to common sense. According to practical assessment of what people your age need to maintain their well-being. People my age, or me specifically. Michael rubbed his forehead with the gesture of someone whose patience was being tested beyond its limits. Mom, what do you want me to say? That it's fine for you to make choices that put you at risk and make everyone who loves you crazy with worry? I want you to say that it's my choice to make, even if it's the wrong choice, especially if it's the wrong choice, because it's my wrong choice to make. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a fundamental disagreement about autonomy, responsibility, and the nature of love itself. Michael loved her enough to want to protect her from all possible harm, while Maggie was asking for the right to face potential harm on her own terms. I don't understand this, Mom. 6 months ago you were a reasonable person who made sensible decisions. Now you're acting like accepting help is some kind of defeat. 6 months ago, I was a person whose opinions about her own life mattered to her family. Now I'm apparently a person whose preferences are obstacles to be overcome. That's not fair, isn't it? Michael, when was the last time you asked me what I wanted instead of telling me what I needed? The question hung between them, and Maggie watched her son's face as he tried to remember a conversation that had prioritized her desires over his assessment of her circumstances. I ask you all the time how you're doing, what you need, whether you're happy. You ask me how I'm adjusting to plans you've already made. You ask me whether I'm accepting circumstances you've already created. You don't ask me what I want my life to look like, because what you want isn't always what's best for you. According to whom? According to reality. According to the facts of aging and health and practical limitations. Michael, do you hear yourself? You're talking about me like I'm a child who can't be trusted to make decisions about her own life. I'm talking about you like someone I love, who might be making decisions based on fear of change rather than honest assessment of options. What if I'm making decisions based on knowledge of myself that you don't have access to? What kind of knowledge? Maggie took a deep breath, preparing to articulate something she had never put into words before, even to herself. The knowledge that this house, this neighborhood, these routines, these connections give my life a sense of purpose and meaning that I can't replicate anywhere else. The knowledge that managing my own space, making my own meals, tending my own garden, maintaining my own relationships, makes me feel like myself in ways that being cared for by professionals never could. But Mom, let me finish. The knowledge that I'd rather face uncertainty in a place that feels like home than safety in a place that feels like exile. The knowledge that my identity is tied up with my independence in ways that you can't understand because you've never had to choose between safety and selfhood. Michael stared at her as if she had revealed herself to be a completely different person than the one he thought he knew. I had no idea you felt that strongly about it. Because you never asked. You assessed my situation based on your understanding of what people my age need, but you never asked what I need specifically. I thought I was protecting you. You were, but you were also managing me. And there's a difference between protection and management that I'm only beginning to understand. Michael set the application papers aside and leaned back in his chair, looking suddenly exhausted. So what do you want me to do? Stop caring about your well-being. Stop worrying about your safety. Pretend that age doesn't bring limitations and risks. I want you to care about my well-being enough to include my definition of well-being in your assessments. I want you to worry about my safety while respecting my right to make my own risk calculations. I want you to acknowledge that age brings limitations while allowing me to decide how to work within those limitations. And if you make choices that I think are dangerous, then you love me enough to let me make them anyway. Even if something happens to you because of those choices. Especially then. Because the alternative is me being safe, but not being myself. Michael was quiet for a long time, processing a conversation that had apparently challenged assumptions he hadn't realized he was making. I don't know how to stop worrying about you, he said finally. I'm not asking you to stop worrying. I'm asking you to worry in ways that don't require me to surrender my autonomy to ease your anxiety. What does that look like practically? It looks like helping me make my home safer instead of insisting I leave it. It looks like helping me build support networks here, instead of assuming I need to move somewhere with built-in support. It looks like asking what I need instead of telling me what I should want. And if those solutions aren't enough, if something happens anyway, then something happens. And we deal with it when it does, instead of restructuring my entire life around preventing possibilities that may never occur. Michael picked up the application papers and stared at them as if they represented a future that was dissolving before his eyes. I don't think I can call Jennifer and tell her you're not taking the apartment. Why not? Because I've already told everyone, Patricia, the twins, my friends at work, people at the grocery store, that this was the plan. I've presented this as the obvious solution to everyone who's been asking about your situation. The admission revealed another layer of the pressure Maggie had been feeling. Michael hadn't just been advocating for senior living with her, he had been promising it to his social network as evidence of his responsible management of his mother's needs. So, this is also about your reputation as a good son. Partly, yes. I don't want people to think I'm neglecting you or failing to provide appropriate care. What if appropriate care means respecting my choices even when they're not the choices you would make? Then I guess I need to learn how to explain that to people who think I should be more assertive about protecting you from yourself. For the first time in months, Maggie heard something in her son's voice that sounded like genuine consideration of her perspective, rather than patient management of her concerns. Michael, what if we approached this differently? What if instead of focusing on getting me to accept a solution you've chosen, we worked together to address the concerns that solution was meant to solve? What do you mean? I mean, what if we figured out how to make my living here work better, instead of assuming it can't work at all? Michael looked up from the papers with something that might have been hope. You'd be willing to make some changes? Accept some help? I'd be willing to make changes that address real problems without surrendering control over my life. I'd be willing to accept help that enhances my independence rather than replacing it. What would that look like? I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out. If you're willing to explore solutions that start with my staying here instead of starting with my leaving here. Michael folded the application papers and put them back in the folder. Okay, he said. Let's try that. The word okay carried the weight of a fundamental shift in their relationship, from him managing her future to them negotiating it together. It wasn't the end of their differences, but it was the beginning of a conversation that treated her as a participant rather than a recipient of decisions made on her behalf. For the first time in months, Maggie felt like her voice in her own life mattered more than everyone else's assessment of what that life should look like. The transformation didn't happen overnight. In the weeks following their New Year's Day confrontation, Maggie and Michael had to learn an entirely new way of communicating. One that required him to ask instead of assume and her to speak clearly about her needs, instead of simply resisting his suggestions. It was awkward at first, like learning to dance together after years of stepping on each other's toes. Their first collaborative effort came when Patricia suggested a family meeting to discuss practical solutions. Unlike the previous gatherings where Michael had presented options for Maggie to consider, this meeting was structured around identifying specific concerns and brainstorming ways to address them without requiring her to leave her home. "Let's start with the real issues," Patricia said, settling into Maggie's living room with a legal pad and the organizational skills that made her successful in real estate. Not the theoretical ones, but the actual day-to-day challenges that need addressing. Emma and Sophie had been included in this discussion, partly because they had become unexpected advocates for their grandmother's autonomy, and partly because they would be affected by whatever solutions the family developed. "The medical stuff is the biggest worry," Michael began, his tone more collaborative than directive. "The distance to your doctor, getting to appointments. What happens if you need emergency care? What about Dr. Bradley down on Cedar Avenue?" Sophie suggested. "He's like 5 minutes from here, and Mrs. Henderson says he's really good with older patients." The suggestion came from a 15-year-old, but it was more practical than months of adult discussions about proximity to medical facilities. Dr. Bradley's practice was not only closer but specialized in geriatric care, offering services that were actually relevant to Maggie's needs rather than theoretically appropriate for someone her age. "I could call and see if he's accepting new patients," Maggie offered, feeling strange about participating in planning her own care instead of simply receiving plans others had made. "What about the house maintenance?" Michael asked. "The gutters, the furnace, the yard work, all the things Dad used to handle." This had been a source of particular anxiety for him, watching his mother struggle with tasks that required physical strength or technical knowledge she didn't possess. But instead of using these challenges as evidence that she needed to move somewhere with professional maintenance, they were now treating them as problems that could be solved. "I've been thinking about that," Maggie said. Mrs. Chen mentioned that her son runs a handyman service, small repairs, seasonal maintenance, that sort of thing. And the boy next door has been asking if I need help with yard work. "What about snow removal?" Patricia asked. That's been a real concern for Michael, especially after that ice storm last year. "The city has a senior services program," Emma said, pulling out her phone. "I looked it up for a school project. They provide snow removal and emergency check-ins for elderly residents who register with them." Again, the solution came from an unexpected source. A teenager doing research for a school assignment had uncovered resources that the adults hadn't thought to investigate. It was becoming clear that their family's tendency to focus on moving Maggie rather than supporting her had prevented them from exploring help that was already available. "What about social isolation?" Michael asked, broaching the subject that had been central to his advocacy for senior living. "The book club is nice, but what about daily interaction? Regular social contact?" "Actually," Maggie said, surprising herself with the admission, "I've been thinking about volunteering more at the library. They need help with their literacy program, and it would give me a regular schedule and purpose. And I could visit more often," Sophie offered. "Now that I can drive, I could stop by after school sometimes." "Not all the time," she added quickly, "but regularly." The conversation continued for 2 hours, addressing concerns ranging from grocery shopping to emergency communication to household security. What emerged was not a single comprehensive solution, but a network of small adjustments and support systems that could address Michael's worries without requiring Maggie to surrender her independence. "This is actually doable," Patricia said, reviewing the notes she'd taken. "It's not as neat and tidy as a senior living facility, but it addresses the real issues." "It requires more coordination," Michael admitted, "but maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe being involved in the solutions is better than just knowing you're somewhere safe." The shift in his perspective was subtle but significant. Instead of seeking to eliminate his worry by placing Maggie somewhere she would be managed by professionals, he was accepting that caring for family members required ongoing effort and attention, but that this effort could be collaborative rather than unilateral. The implementation of their plan began the following week with a flurry of phone calls and appointments. Dr. Bradley's office had an opening for new patients, and his nurse spent 30 minutes on the phone with Maggie discussing her medical history and current needs. The conversation revealed that many of her health concerns could be better managed with a doctor who specialized in geriatric care rather than the general practitioner she'd been seeing for decades. The handyman service proved to be a revelation. James Chen, Mrs. Chen's son, was a licensed contractor who specialized in aging-in-place modifications. He walked through Maggie's house with the eye of someone who understood both the challenges of aging and the importance of maintaining independence. "The bathroom is where most accidents happen," he explained, examining the upstairs hall bath. "But we can install grab bars, improve the lighting, maybe add a shower seat. Small changes that make a big difference in safety." "What about the stairs?" Michael asked, his concern evident in his voice. "We could install a second handrail, improve the lighting, maybe add some non-slip strips. But honestly, Mrs. Richardson moves around these stairs just fine. The goal isn't to eliminate all risk, it's to minimize unnecessary risk while preserving her ability to live normally." James's approach aligned perfectly with what Maggie had been trying to articulate: the difference between reasonable safety measures and excessive protection. He understood that the goal was to support her independence, not replace it with dependency. The emergency communication system they installed was surprisingly sophisticated, a medical alert device that connected directly to emergency services, but also to a family notification system that would contact Michael and Patricia if it was activated. The device was discreet enough that Maggie didn't feel like she was wearing a sign of her vulnerability, but comprehensive enough that Michael's worst-case scenario concerns were addressed. "This gives me so much peace of mind," Michael told her during the installation. "Not because it eliminates risk, but because it means you won't be facing any emergency alone." The grocery delivery service turned out to be more flexible than either of them had anticipated. Rather than replacing Maggie's independence with professional management, it provided backup support for days when weather or health made shopping difficult, while still allowing her to maintain her normal routines when she felt capable. "I can still go to the store when I want to," she explained to Dorothy Hanson, who had been curious about the changes. "But now I don't have to go when I don't want to. It's support, not replacement." The volunteer work at the library provided something that no senior living facility could have offered: a sense of purpose that was connected to her skills and experience rather than designed to keep her busy. The literacy program needed someone with teaching experience and infinite patience with adult learners, and Maggie discovered that helping others learn to read gave her days the kind of meaning she had been missing. "I love this," she told the program coordinator after her first week. "It feels like real work. Important work." "It is real work," the coordinator replied, "and you're really good at it." The affirmation that she was still capable of meaningful contribution was more valuable than any social activity a senior living facility could have provided. She wasn't just being kept busy, she was being useful in ways that mattered to people beyond herself. The twins' increased involvement in her life proved to be beneficial for everyone. Sophie's after-school visits became a regular Tuesday and Thursday routine that provided Maggie with consistent social contact and gave Sophie a quiet place to do homework away from the chaos of settling into their new house. Emma's visits were less frequent, but more intensive. Weekend afternoons when she would help with household projects while practicing her lines for school plays. The arrangement gave Emma the kind of individual attention that was harder to find in a busy family household, while giving Maggie the pleasure of watching her granddaughter's talents develop. "It's funny," Emma said during one of these visits. "Dad was so worried about you being isolated, but I see you more now than I did before they moved." The observation highlighted something that none of them had anticipated. The new arrangements actually created more meaningful contact between Maggie and her family than the previous pattern of obligatory Sunday dinners and crisis-driven interactions. Michael's role in her life evolved from manager to consultant. Instead of making decisions for her, he helped her research options and implement choices. When she decided to update her will and estate planning, he connected her with an attorney who specialized in elder law. When she wanted to explore adaptive equipment for her kitchen, he spent a Saturday helping her research and install tools that made cooking easier without making it feel institutional. "I like this better," he told her after they'd spent an afternoon installing lever-style door handles throughout the house, being helpful instead of being in charge. "I like it better too," she replied. "It feels like partnership instead of management." The financial aspects of their new arrangement proved to be surprisingly manageable. The cost of the modifications, services, and support systems was significantly less than the monthly fees for senior living, and Maggie retained the equity in her home and the freedom to adjust her spending based on her actual needs, rather than a comprehensive package of services. "We could have been doing this all along," Patricia observed during a family dinner at Maggie's house, a tradition they had resumed now that the pressure around her living situation had been resolved. "Instead of assuming she needed to move somewhere else, we could have been figuring out how to make her work better." The dinner itself was different from the previous Sunday gatherings. Instead of feeling like performances of family connection, these meals felt organic and comfortable. Maggie cooked what she wanted to cook, accepted help when she needed it, and enjoyed the company without the underlying tension of unspoken agendas. "The house feels different," Sophie observed, looking around the dining room that had been the site of so many difficult conversations about Maggie's future. "Happier somehow." "It feels like home again," Maggie replied, instead of feeling like a problem to be solved. The comment prompted laughter from everyone at the table, but it also acknowledged how much their family dynamic had changed. Maggie was no longer the aging mother whose needs created problems for everyone else. She was the family matriarch whose preferences and autonomy were respected and supported. The weekly check-ins that Michael instituted were perhaps the most significant change in their relationship. Instead of calling to assess her condition or push her toward decisions he preferred, he called simply to stay connected. The conversations covered everything from current events to family gossip to his work challenges, returning to the kind of easy communication they had enjoyed before her housing situation became a source of conflict. "I realized I had stopped talking to you about my life because I was so focused on managing yours," he admitted during one of these calls. "I missed just being your son instead of being your guardian." "I missed that too," Maggie replied. "I missed feeling like you valued my opinions instead of just worrying about my circumstances." The rebuilding of their relationship was ongoing, requiring constant attention to the balance between care and control, support and independence. But both of them had learned something valuable about the difference between loving someone enough to protect them and loving someone enough to respect their choices, even when those choices create. The transformation didn't happen overnight. In the weeks following their New Year's Day confrontation, Maggie and Michael had to learn an entirely new way of communicating, one that required him to ask instead of assume, and her to speak clearly about her needs, instead of simply resisting his suggestions. It was awkward at first, like learning to dance together after years of stepping on each other's toes. Their first collaborative effort came when Patricia suggested a family meeting to discuss practical solutions. Unlike the previous gatherings where Michael had presented options for Maggie to consider, this meeting was structured around identifying specific concerns and brainstorming ways to address them without requiring her to leave her home. "Let's start with the real issues," Patricia said, settling into Maggie's living room with a legal pad and the organizational skills that made her successful in real estate. Not the theoretical ones, but the actual day-to-day challenges that need addressing. Emma and Sophie had been included in this discussion, partly because they had become unexpected advocates for their grandmother's autonomy, and partly because they would be affected by whatever solutions the family developed. "The medical stuff is the biggest worry," Michael began, his tone more collaborative than directive. "The distance to your doctor, getting to appointments. What happens if you need emergency care? What about Dr. Bradley down on Cedar Avenue?" Sophie suggested. "He's like 5 minutes from here, and Mrs. Henderson says he's really good with older patients." The suggestion came from a 15-year-old, but it was more practical than months of adult discussions about proximity to medical facilities. Dr. Bradley's practice was not only closer but specialized in geriatric care, offering services that were actually relevant to Maggie's needs rather than theoretically appropriate for someone her age. I could call and see if he's accepting new patients. Maggie offered, feeling strange about participating in planning her own care instead of simply receiving plans others had made. What about the house maintenance? Michael asked. The gutters, the furnace, the yard work, all the things Dad used to handle. This had been a source of particular anxiety for him, watching his mother struggle with tasks that required physical strength or technical knowledge she didn't possess. But instead of using these challenges as evidence that she needed to move somewhere with professional maintenance, they were now treating them as problems that could be solved. I've been thinking about that, Maggie said. Mrs. Chen mentioned that her son runs a handyman service. Small repairs, seasonal maintenance, that sort of thing. And the boy next door has been asking if I need help with yard work. What about snow removal? Patricia asked. That's been a real concern for Michael, especially after that ice storm last year. The city has a senior services program, Emma said, pulling out her phone. I looked it up for a school project. They provide snow removal and emergency check-ins for elderly residents who register with them. Again, the solution came from an unexpected source. A teenager doing research for a school assignment had uncovered resources that the adults hadn't thought to investigate. It was becoming clear that their family's tendency to focus on moving Maggie rather than supporting her had prevented them from exploring help that was already available. What about social isolation? Michael asked, broaching the subject that had been central to his advocacy for senior living. The book club is nice, but what about daily interaction, regular social contact? Actually, Maggie said, surprising herself with the admission, I've been thinking about volunteering more at the library. They need help with their literacy program, and it would give me a regular schedule and purpose, and I could visit more often, Sophie offered. Now that I can drive, I could stop by after school sometimes. Not all the time, she added quickly, but regularly. The conversation continued for 2 hours, addressing concerns ranging from grocery shopping to emergency communication to household security. What emerged was not a single comprehensive solution, but a network of small adjustments and support systems that could address Michael's worries without requiring Maggie to surrender her independence. This is actually doable, Patricia said, reviewing the notes she'd taken. It's not as neat and tidy as a senior living facility, but it addresses the real issues. It requires more coordination, Michael admitted, but maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe being involved in the solutions is better than just knowing you're somewhere safe. The shift in his perspective was subtle but significant. Instead of seeking to eliminate his worry by placing Maggie somewhere she would be managed by professionals, he was accepting that caring for family members required ongoing effort and attention, but that this effort could be collaborative rather than unilateral. The implementation of their plan began the following week with a flurry of phone calls and appointments. Dr. Bradley's office had an opening for new patients, and his nurse spent 30 minutes on the phone with Maggie, discussing her medical history and current needs. The conversation revealed that many of her health concerns could be better managed with a doctor who specialized in geriatric care rather than the general practitioner she'd been seeing for decades. The handyman service proved to be a revelation. James Chen, Mrs. Chen's son, was a licensed contractor who specialized in aging-in-place modifications. He walked through Maggie's house with the eye of someone who understood both the challenges of aging and the importance of maintaining independence. The bathroom is where most accidents happen, he explained, examining the upstairs hall bath, but we can install grab bars, improve the lighting. Maybe add a shower seat, small changes that make a big difference in safety. What about the stairs? Michael asked, his concern evident in his voice. We could install a second handrail, improve the lighting, maybe add some non-slip strips. But honestly, Mrs. Richardson moves around these stairs just fine. The goal isn't to eliminate all risk. It's to minimize unnecessary risk while preserving her ability to live normally. James's approach aligned perfectly with what Maggie had been trying to articulate, the difference between reasonable safety measures and excessive protection. He understood that the goal was to support her independence, not replace it with dependency. The emergency communication system they installed was surprisingly sophisticated, a medical alert device that connected directly to emergency services, but also to a family notification system that would contact Michael and Patricia if it was activated. The device was discreet enough that Maggie didn't feel like she was wearing a sign of her vulnerability, but comprehensive enough that Michael's worst-case scenario concerns were addressed. "This gives me so much peace of mind," Michael told her during the installation. "Not because it eliminates risk, but because it means you won't be facing any emergency alone." The grocery delivery service turned out to be more flexible than either of them had anticipated. Rather than replacing Maggie's independence with professional management, it provided backup support for days when weather or health made shopping difficult, while still allowing her to maintain her normal routines when she felt capable. "I can still go to the store when I want to," she explained to Dorothy Hanson, who had been curious about the changes. "But now I don't have to go when I don't want to. It's support, not replacement." The volunteer work at the library provided something that no senior living facility could have offered, a sense of purpose that was connected to her skills and experience rather than designed to keep her busy. The literacy program needed someone with teaching experience and infinite patience with adult learners, and Maggie discovered that helping others learn to read gave her days the kind of meaning she had been missing. "I love this," she told the program coordinator after her first week. "It feels like real work, important work." "It is real work," the coordinator replied, "and you're really good at it." The affirmation that she was still capable of meaningful contribution was more valuable than any social activity a senior living facility could have provided. She wasn't just being kept busy, she was being useful in ways that mattered to people beyond herself. The twins' increased involvement in her life proved to be beneficial for everyone. Sophie's after-school visits became a regular Tuesday and Thursday routine that provided Maggie with consistent social contact and gave Sophie a quiet place to do homework away from the chaos of settling into their new house. Emma's visits were less frequent but more intensive. Weekend afternoons when she would help with household projects while practicing her lines for school plays. The arrangement gave Emma the kind of individual attention that was harder to find in a busy family household, while giving Maggie the pleasure of watching her granddaughter's talents develop. "It's funny," Emma said during one of these visits. "Dad was so worried about you being isolated, but I see you more now than I did before they moved." The observation highlighted something that none of them had anticipated. The new arrangements actually created more meaningful contact between Maggie and her family than the previous pattern of obligatory Sunday dinners and crisis-driven interactions. Michael's role in her life evolved from manager to consultant. Instead of making decisions for her, he helped her research options and implement choices. When she decided to update her will and estate planning, he connected her with an attorney who specialized in elder law. When she wanted to explore adaptive equipment for her kitchen, he spent a Saturday helping her research and install tools that made cooking easier without making it feel institutional. "I like this better," he told her after they'd spent an afternoon installing lever-style door handles throughout the house, being helpful instead of being in charge. "I like it better too," she replied. "It feels like partnership instead of management." The financial aspects of their new arrangement proved to be surprisingly manageable. The cost of the modifications, services, and support systems was significantly less than the monthly fees for senior living. And Maggie retained the equity in her home and the freedom to adjust her spending based on her actual needs, rather than a comprehensive package of services. "We could have been doing this all along," Patricia observed during a family dinner at Maggie's house. A tradition they had resumed now that the pressure around her living situation had been resolved. "Instead of assuming she needed to move somewhere else, we could have been figuring out how to make her work better." The dinner itself was different from the previous Sunday gatherings. Instead of feeling like performances of family connection, these meals felt organic and comfortable. Maggie cooked what she wanted to cook, accepted help when she needed it, and enjoyed the company without the underlying tension of unspoken agendas. "The house feels different," Sophie observed, looking around the dining room that had been the site of so many difficult conversations about Maggie's future. "Happier. Somehow. It feels like home again," Maggie replied, instead of feeling like a problem to be solved. The comment prompted laughter from everyone at the table, but it also acknowledged how much their family dynamic had changed. Maggie was no longer the aging mother whose needs created problems for everyone else. She was the family matriarch whose preferences and autonomy were respected and supported. The weekly check-ins that Michael instituted were perhaps the most significant change in their relationship. Instead of calling to assess her condition or push her toward decisions he preferred, he called simply to stay connected. The conversations covered everything from current events to family gossip to his work challenges, returning to the kind of easy communication they had enjoyed before her housing situation became a source of conflict. "I realized I had stopped talking to you about my life because I was so focused on managing yours," he admitted during one of these calls. "I missed just being your son instead of being your guardian." "I missed that too," Maggie replied. "I missed feeling like you valued my opinions instead of just worrying about my circumstances." The rebuilding of their relationship was ongoing, requiring constant attention to the balance between care and control, support and independence. But both of them had learned something valuable about the difference between loving someone enough to protect them and loving someone enough to respect their choices, even when those choices created anxiety for the people who cared about them. The success of their collaborative approach had an unexpected side effect. It changed how Maggie thought about aging itself. Instead of viewing it as a process of inevitable decline that required increasingly managed living, she began to see it as a series of challenges that could be met with creativity, support, and adaptive solutions. "I'm not the same person I was at 40, she told Susan Martinez during one of their coffee dates, "but I'm not a diminished version of that person either. I'm a different person with different needs and different capabilities, and I can build a life that works for who I am now, instead of mourning the life that worked for who I used to be." The insight applied beyond her housing situation to her entire approach to living as an older adult. Instead of accepting limitations as permanent barriers, she could treat them as problems to be solved with the right resources and support systems. Anxiety for the people who cared about them. The success of their collaborative approach had an unexpected side effect. It changed how Maggie thought about aging itself. Instead of viewing it as a process of inevitable decline that required increasingly managed living, she began to see it as a series of challenges that could be met with creativity, support, and adaptive solutions. "I'm not the same person I was at 40, she told Susan Martinez during one of their coffee dates, "but I'm not a diminished version of that person either. I'm a different person with different needs and different capabilities, and I can build a life that works for who I am now, instead of mourning the life that worked for who I used to be." The insight applied beyond her housing situation to her entire approach to living as an older adult. Instead of accepting limitations as permanent barriers, she could treat them as problems to be solved with the right resources and support systems. 2 years later, Maggie Richardson stood in her kitchen on a brilliant October morning, preparing for what had become one of her favorite weekly activities, hosting the Silver Scribes, a writing group she had started for older adults who wanted to document their life stories. The kitchen table that had once been the site of so many difficult conversations about her future was now covered with notebooks, pens, and the remnants of the coffee cake she'd made for her guests. The group had grown from 3 tentative participants to 12 regular members, all of them discovering that their experiences contained stories worth preserving and sharing. Today they would be working on what Maggie had come to think of as turning point narratives, the moments when life shifted direction in unexpected ways. "The key," she was explaining to newcomer Robert Walsh, a 74-year-old retired engineer, "is to identify not just what happened, but what changed in your understanding of yourself or your possibilities." Robert nodded thoughtfully, his pen poised over a blank page. "I think my turning point was when my daughter told me I needed to move to assisted living. Not because I didn't, but because that's when I realized I had to stop letting other people's fears dictate my choices." The comment made Maggie smile, recognizing the familiar pattern of adult children whose love manifested as attempts to eliminate all risk from their parents' lives. "How did you handle that conversation?" "I asked her to help me figure out how to stay in my home safely instead of assuming I had to leave it to be safe. We ended up creating a support system that works better than anything an institution could have provided." The parallel to her own experience was striking, reinforcing Maggie's growing understanding that her conflict with Michael hadn't been unique. Across the country, families were navigating the same tension between protection and autonomy, safety and independence, love and control. That's a perfect example of what we're exploring today, she told the group. The moments when we realize we have more power over our circumstances than we thought we did. As the silver scribes settled into their writing, Maggie found herself reflecting on her own turning point narrative. If someone had told her 3 years ago that she would be leading writing workshops, coordinating community programs, and living independently in her own home with a support network she had helped design, she would have found it impossible to believe. The transformation hadn't just been about staying in her house, though that remained important to her. It had been about discovering that the challenges of aging could be met with creativity and collaboration rather than surrender and management. More significantly, it had been about learning to advocate for her own vision of a meaningful life, instead of accepting other people's definitions of what was safe, appropriate, or realistic for someone her age. The literacy program at the library had evolved into something neither she nor the coordinators had anticipated. What began as volunteer work had become a pilot program for community-based education that served adults who had fallen through the cracks of traditional educational systems. Maggie found herself working with people ranging from 25 to 75, all of them discovering that learning was possible at any stage of life. Mrs. Richardson, her student Marcus, had told her the previous week, "You changed my life. I never thought I'd be able to read well enough to help my kids with their homework." The gratitude in his voice had reminded her why she had resisted the comfortable but passive existence of senior living. She needed to feel useful, needed to contribute something meaningful, needed to be valued for her skills and experience rather than simply cared for because of her age. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Michael's name appeared on the caller ID, and she answered with the easy warmth that had returned to their relationship once the pressure around her living situation had been resolved. "Morning, Mom. How's the writing group going?" "Wonderfully, we have a new member today who reminds me a lot of you. Actually, retired engineer. Very analytical approach to storytelling. Sounds interesting. Listen, I was calling because Patricia and I have some news we wanted to share with you." Something in his tone made Maggie pause in her preparation of coffee refills for the group. "Good news, I hope?" "Very good news. Patricia's been offered a position with a major real estate development company. It's an incredible opportunity managing sustainable housing projects throughout the Midwest." "That's wonderful for her. She's so talented." "It really is wonderful. The thing is, the position is based in Denver." The words hit Maggie with unexpected force. Denver was more than distance. It was a different time zone, different climate, different life entirely. The family connections she had fought so hard to maintain would be strained in ways that no amount of technology could fully bridge. "Denver," she repeated, processing the implications. "I know it's a big change. We've been wrestling with the decision for weeks. The girls would finish high school here and then join us for college, but it means leaving the community we've built, leaving you, starting over in a place where we don't have any family connections." The careful way he presented the information told Maggie that this wasn't a consultation about whether they should move, but a notification that they were moving. The difference was important. It meant they had learned to make their own decisions without requiring her approval, just as she had learned to make hers without requiring their permission. "When would this happen?" she asked. "This summer. June, probably. It gives us time to finish the school year, sell the house, figure out the logistics." "And how do you feel about it?" "Excited, nervous, guilty about leaving you, worried about the girls, optimistic about the opportunities. Basically, every emotion possible all at the same time." The honesty was refreshing. Instead of presenting the decision as obviously correct and expecting her to be supportive, Michael was acknowledging the complexity of choices that affected multiple people in different ways. "You shouldn't feel guilty about pursuing opportunities that are good for your family," Maggie said, meaning it. "That's what families do. They grow and change and move toward possibilities that serve their needs." "But what about our support system here? What about the arrangements we've made for your care? What about Sunday dinners and the girls' visits and all the connections we've built?" The questions revealed, that Michael had learned something important about the difference between managing her life and being part of it. He wasn't asking her to adapt to his decision, he was genuinely concerned about how the change would affect her well-being. "We'll figure it out," she said, surprised by her own confidence. "The support system we built here proves that it's possible to create what you need instead of just accepting what's available. If we can do it once, we can do it again. Are you sure? Because we don't have to take this opportunity. There will be other chances. Michael, 3 years ago you were ready to move me to senior living partly because you were worried about being 45 minutes away. Now you're considering moving to Denver, and you're asking my opinion instead of making plans for me. That's growth." "I guess it is. But I'm still worried about leaving you." "Good. Worry is evidence that you care. But don't let worry stop you from building the life you want, any more than you should let it stop me from building the life I want." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering practical concerns and emotional complexities with the kind of honesty that had become natural to them since their confrontation 2 years earlier. When Maggie hung up, she found herself processing emotions she hadn't expected: excitement for her son's family mixed with grief for the distance it would create, pride in their growth mixed with sadness about the changes it would require. The Silver Scribes had finished their writing and were sharing their turning point stories when Emma arrived for her regular Saturday visit. At 17, Emma had developed into a poised young woman whose confidence seemed to grow from her increasing independence rather than diminish because of it. "Grandma, can I talk to you about something?" Emma asked after the writing group had departed and they were cleaning up the kitchen together. "Of course. Dad told us about the Denver opportunity. How do you feel about it?" The directness of the question was so characteristic of Emma: no careful navigation around difficult topics, no assumption that adults' feelings were too complex for teenagers to understand. "I feel many things," Maggie replied. "I'm excited for your parents, and worried about the distance and proud of your family's willingness to take risks for good opportunities. But what about you? What about your life here?" "My life here will continue. Different, but continuing." "Aren't you scared of being so far away from us?" The question touched on fears that Maggie hadn't fully acknowledged to herself. The support system they had built depended partly on Michael's nearby presence, even if he was no longer managing her daily life. His family's move would require her to reconstruct her network of connections and support in ways she hadn't anticipated needing to do. "A little scared," she admitted, "but also curious about what I'll discover about myself when I have to create new solutions." "That's very brave. It's very necessary." "Emma, can I tell you something I've learned? Being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and deciding that whatever you're moving toward is more important than whatever you're afraid of." "What are you moving toward?" "I don't know yet. But I'm looking forward to finding out." The conversation with Emma crystallized something that had been developing in Maggie's thinking since Michael's call. His family's move to Denver wasn't just a loss to be endured. It was an opportunity to discover what version of herself would emerge when she had even more autonomy over her life's direction. The next few months were filled with the kind of productive chaos that accompanies major life transitions. Michael and Patricia's house sold quickly. The girls managed their emotional ambivalence about leaving their friends while getting excited about college possibilities in Colorado, and Maggie found herself serving as both advisor and cheerleader for changes that would fundamentally alter her family's geography. But she also found herself making changes of her own. The literacy program had grown large enough to require more coordination than the library could provide with volunteer support. When the opportunity arose to apply for a small municipal grant to formalize the program, Maggie surprised herself by volunteering to write the proposal and serve as program coordinator. "Are you sure you want to take on that level of responsibility?" Dorothy Hanson asked when Maggie mentioned the possibility during their book club meeting. "I'm 70 years old," Maggie replied. "If not now, when?" The grant application required her to articulate the program's goals, methodology, and anticipated outcomes in ways that forced her to think systematically about work she had been doing intuitively. The process revealed that she had developed expertise in adult education that was valuable beyond her volunteer contributions. When the grant was approved, Along with a small salary for the coordinator position, Maggie found herself with official employment for the first time since retirement. The work gave her days structure and purpose that had nothing to do with her family relationships, while still allowing her the flexibility to maintain her independence. "I'm proud of you," Susan Martinez told her over coffee the week before Michael's family departure. "You've created exactly the kind of life you wanted instead of accepting the kind of life everyone else thought you should have." "I had help," Maggie replied. "It took my family learning to support my choices instead of trying to improve them." That's the hardest lesson for families to learn, that love sometimes means stepping back instead of stepping in. The farewell dinner at Maggie's house was deliberately festive rather than somber. She prepared Michael's favorite meal and invited Mrs. Chen and her son James, Dorothy Hanson, Susan Martinez, and several members of the Silver Scribes. The gathering felt like a celebration of connections that had sustained them all, rather than a mourning of connections that were ending. "This isn't goodbyes," Sophie announced during dessert. "See you later. We're going to visit, and you're going to visit us, and we're going to video chat, and nothing fundamental about our family is changing." The confidence in her voice reflected the security of a teenager who had learned that family bonds could be maintained across distance when they were built on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than obligation and management. "Besides," Emma added, "Grandma has taught us that you can create the life you want instead of just accepting the life you're given. We're going to create a family that works across time zones." After everyone left and the dishes were cleaned, Maggie sat in her living room surrounded by the evidence of an evening well spent: leftover cake, flowers from her garden, photographs of family gatherings spanning decades. The house felt different than it had during the months when she was fighting to stay in it. Then, it had felt like a fortress she was defending against invasion. Now, it felt like a foundation from which she could build whatever came next. The phone rang, and Jennifer Walsh's name appeared on the caller ID. For a moment, Maggie was puzzled. She hadn't spoken to the Sunshine Senior Living Coordinator in over 2 years. "Mrs. Richardson, I hope I'm not calling it a bad time. I wanted to follow up on your housing situation." "My housing situation?" "Well, I know that your son had inquired about our services a while back, and I wanted to see if your circumstances had changed. We currently have several openings, and I thought you might be interested in reconsidering our community." The call felt like a message from an alternate universe, a reminder of the path she had almost taken. For a moment, Maggie tried to imagine the version of herself who had moved to Sunshine Senior Living 2 years earlier. Safe, comfortable, socially stimulated, and profoundly diminished. "Thank you for thinking of me," she said, "but my circumstances have changed in ways that make your services unnecessary." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Has your health declined? Do you need more specialized care than we can provide?" "Actually, my health has improved, and my need for institutional care has disappeared entirely." After hanging up, Maggie laughed at the irony. Jennifer's assumption that changed circumstances must mean increased dependence revealed how limited the imagination around aging had become. The possibility that an older adult might become more autonomous, more engaged, more purposeful over time seemed to be outside the range of expected outcomes. As she prepared for bed, Maggie reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The text message that had started it all, Michael's expression of frustration about finding somewhere else for her to die, had actually led to her finding somewhere else to live. Not a different location, but a different way of being in the same location. Not a managed existence, but a self-directed one. The transformation hadn't been about proving that she was still young or denying the realities of aging. It had been about insisting that aging was compatible with autonomy, that needing support didn't require surrendering control, that love could be expressed through respect for someone's choices rather than protection from their consequences. Standing at her bedroom window, looking out at the neighborhood that had become home in ways it never was when she was simply the wife and mother who lived there, Maggie felt grateful for the crisis that had forced all of them to examine their assumptions about aging and the nature of care itself. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and new opportunities. The literacy program needed expansion. The Silver Scribes were planning a community reading of their collected stories. Her garden required fall preparation. Her family in Denver would need regular contact and occasional visits. All of it felt manageable, even exciting, because it was all chosen rather than imposed. At 70 years old, Maggie Richardson had learned that the most important thing about growing older wasn't learning to accept limitations, but learning to distinguish between limitations that were real and limitations that were simply assumed. The house settled around her with the comfortable sounds of a place where someone was truly at home. Outside, the October wind that had once seemed ominous now sounded like possibility, carrying the promise of seasons yet to come and stories yet to be written. Up next, looking for more? We've got two amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest upload.